Welcome everyone to the first plenary of the Black Studies and Romanticism virtual conference, which Matt, Carrie, and Gina have entitled it Citation, Appropriation, and Abolition. I want to note that we're going to be recording this, and please everybody check that you're muted. We had some fun muting situations in the last panel, but hopefully we'll all mute and unmute as needed this time around. I'm just going to say a little bit about the format of this plenary and the next one tomorrow. And I'll give some short biographical information of our speakers, and I'm going to let them take it away. I do want to acknowledge that I am sitting on stolen Nipmuc lands, and many of us are situated similarly. And I am grateful for the stewardship of those people whose lands that they rightfully are. So part of the project of this visual conference was to see how we might shake up some of the structures and systems of regular conferences. So rather than having an individual professing to the masses, we really wanted to think about having some sort of collaborations. So we asked two different groups of people to kind of do a plenary and to kind of self-design with the idea of discussion and conversation in mind. So, and I think actually both groups chose a similar style where there will be initial remarks by each person, some short initial remarks, and then there will be discussion among them, and then we will open it out to the wider audience. And I trust that Carrie, Matt, and Gina will signal to us when they're ready to have a full-blown conversation. So now for some bio information. Matt Sandler at Columbia University directs the MA program in American Studies at the Center for the Study of Ethnicity and Race. He is the author of The Black Romantic Revolution, Abolitionist Poets at the End of Slavery that came out last year, and is currently at work on a project about the culture of self-help and comparative racialization in the long 19th century. Carrie Sananan at University of Texas at San Antonio is assistant professor in English and vice president of the Early Caribbean Society. Recent articles and chapters have appeared in Studies in 18th Century Culture, Caribbean Literature and Transitions, Volume 1 from Cambridge University Press out last year, Romantic Circles, and Age of Revolutions. She is now completing her monograph, Myths of Mastery, Traders, Planters, and Colonial Agents, 1750 to 1833 for the University of North Carolina Press. And Eugenia Zarowski at McMaster University is Associate Professor of English and Cultural Studies. She is editor of the journal 18th Century Fiction and author of A Taste for China, English Subjectivity in the Prehistory of Orientalism, Oxford University Press 2013. A founding member of the Bigger Six Collective, Gina has published numerous articles on 18th century literature and material culture in the context of empire and Orientalism. She publishes and speaks regularly on anti-colonial and anti-racist practices in research, teaching, and scholarly publishing. The recipient of 2 SSHRC Insight grants, she is completing a monograph tentatively titled A Funny Thing, The Undisciplined 18th Century, and beginning a new research project on East Asian Anglophone diasporic formations from the 18th century to the present. So thank you, all three of you, for saying yes to my annoying invitation and for being here to share your thoughts with us today. And I think I know that Carrie will be going first.
Thank you very much. And thank you for allowing me to go first with Zoom nerves. I appreciate it. Thank you so much to Kate. Thank you to Gina and Matt, my fellow panelists, and for everybody being here. And I will share my screen just for some quotations. That's all, nothing exciting. Let's see, before I get going. This one, okay. And you can just have a look at, those are just slightly longer quotations I'll be looking at. Okay, I just want to quickly say before I get started properly that as somebody who had to leave Trinidad around the age of 9 and went back for summers, but was back and forth between Ireland and Trinidad all through up to my 20s, I missed it very much. And when I was 19, I found that a new course we were doing on Caribbean literature in Trinity College Dublin had resulted in a whole new bookshelf of books by Sylvia Wynter, Deborah McDowell, Carolyn Cooper, Wilson Harris, Stuart Hall, Paul Kilroy, and these books saved me. Finally, I could weave memories of Trinidad into an intellectual life. And so really, I think this plenary, in the spirit of the conference that Kate's outlined, is not delivering anything startling other than sharing other people's thinking. That's been important to me and continues to be important to me. I saw a headline last week, Naomi Osaka does not need Wimbledon. Wimbledon needs Naomi Osaka. And I've had something very similar in my mind for some time since I was invited to be a part of this plenary session. Black studies, I will say, has nothing to gain from Romanticism, but Romanticism needs Black studies. Romanticism needs Black studies if it is ever to fulfill its deferred ideals of abolition, non-coercive humanism and radical empathy, all of which it proclaims but cannot achieve within what Joy James calls the Western womb. In her essay, The Womb of Western Theory, Trauma, Time Theft and the Captive Maternal, James states that Western theory or womb theory creates a template that makes predation of the captive maternal invisible through consumptive relationships that provide the free theorist or citizen with plausible deniability. For James, womb theory is dependent upon the exploitation of captive maternals who can be either biological females or those feminized into caretaking and consumption. This theory highlights plausible deniability, which I'm thinking of as the cognitive dissonance within humanism that I would want to emphasize today in my talk is forged also by romantic abolition. James states that we have to understand the role of captive maternals, and that requires context. Womb theory married democracy with slavery. Womb theory progeny, this is the first quotation on your handout, may cherry pick their theorists for intellectual consistency, but that strategy is not synonymous with their coherence. Or a correlation within the devastations of the material reality of rape and captivity. Unmoored from captive maternals, theory becomes art, a fabrication that when faced with perspectives of violent captivity from the enslaved might blink rather than see theory. Unfortunately, progeny of womb theory burn more bridges than it builds. In her preceding discussion, James outlines how Hannah Arendt and Michel Foucault in particular, examples of the progeny, quote, exhibit white racial double consciousness, which fails to recognize Black experience as part of the history of genocide. Similarly, I am arguing today that romantic theory as self-reflexive consciousness and the theoretical conscience of modernity has not yet fully recognized Black experience as anything other than peripheral to its main concerns. And here I note Bakari Diaby's work, I think he's here today, making a somewhat similar call perhaps in his essay that encouraged us to think about Black women. I also note here the work of Fran Botkin and Paul Youngquist, who have centered Black studies within Romanticism. But by and large, we are all here today because what type of relationship there might be between Black studies and Romanticism persists. As I see it, the very real questions for this conference are, one, what bridges is womb theory willing to burn and which will it cease to burn? And two, what bridges is it willing to build? Romanticism must acknowledge the enslaved lives and labour that underwrite its liberty and democracy, not as its other, but as its foundation, and render itself open to the considerable leverages of the Black matrix, who, quote, leverages her power against captor and captivity. Romanticism must shift from its imagined freedom to sit with captive maternals and attend closely to what they have to say. From their bellies, from their labour, from their stolen children, the white centre made itself. I invoke Aimé Césaire via Marx to say that not just empire, but romantic abolitionist humanism also comes dripping with blood, while proclaiming itself as liberatory, universal, and exemplary. What we are now living with is a post-slavery, post-colonial, not decolonial world order, forged out of the neoliberal dynamics of the Romantic period. It is still dripping with blood. It is why in 2021, France wants us to celebrate Napoleon and not Toussaint Louverture. It is why Britain wants us to celebrate Winston Churchill and footnote Mary Prince. It is why the US wants us to celebrate Juneteenth as the freedom of the founding fathers, while prohibiting teaching why Harriet Tubman said that slavery is the next thing to hell. In his new book, Out of the Dark Night, Achille Mbembe, like James, argues for bridges, not between this unreformable whiteness and its others, but a bridge that departs from what must be abolished to a new place, a bridge over an abyss. Quote, the critique of European humanism and universalism within post-colonial thought is not an end in itself. It serves to open the way to an investigation of the possibility of politics of fellowship. The precondition of this politics of fellowship is recognition of the other in his or her difference. Because romantic abolition conceived of itself as an antithesis of slavery, it could not recognize the enslaved Black experience as central to liberty because it simultaneously did not recognize Black people as fully human. In her new book, Becoming Human, Zakiya Iman Jackson goes further to argue that Enlightenment thought was not merely, quote, Black exclusion or denied humanity, but rather the violent imposition and appropriation, inclusion and recognition of Blackened humanity in the interests of plasticizing that very humanity. Many Black studies thinkers for some time now have been urging an alternative humanism articulated by Blackness as a site of hope of all the promises the West has proved incapable of delivering. From Frantz Fanon's new humanism in Black Skin, White Masks, Aimé Césaire, Sylvia Wynter, Achille Mbembe, Jackson, as I've just quoted, Joy James, Hortense Spillers, William Paris, the Combahee River Collective, to name a few, offer articulations of how Black experience has been the site of what Paris calls, quote, humanism's secret shadow. A shadow that was created when Western humanism constituted itself by the split between human as knower and human as object in anthropology. And this occasioned, quote, was occasioned by the soon to be colonized New World. Or in the words of David Scott, quote, Europe's discovery of self is simultaneous with its discovery of others. And this self-reflexivity, this self-consciousness epitomizes romantic humanism. In the words of Jeffrey Hartman, quote, every increase in consciousness is accompanied by an increase in self-consciousness. The whiteness of this self-consciousness remains unacknowledged by the progeny of whim theory. This is why Western humanism cannot, as Césaire puts it, be a measure of the world. But from Black studies, Romanticism can learn what it really yearns for can be found in the shadow that was forged in the split of Western humanism, Blackness and being shadow humanism. That the split of Romantic humanism is exclusionary and white supremacist is perhaps grasped here by William Cooper when in the task he declares that he will not have a slave to till my ground. I'd much rather myself be the slave and wear the bonds. But despite its denouncement, Cooper's statement cannot abolish mastery as it maintains the status of white freedom as the location of the fully human while rejecting it. Even his refusal lays the grounds for the tropological emergence of slavery as constitutive of freedom. In one of her 1989 essays on Wordsworth's The Prelude, Mary Jacobus asks, could it be that with the increasing of the abolition movement and the eventual outlawing of the slave trade, slavery became capable of functioning as its opposite, a metaphor for freedom? And you might remember that Srinivasa Ramanujan discusses this quotation in his Tropicopolitans. Jacobus had noted this paradox in abolitionism that creates white double consciousness. Abolition announces itself as if it was not itself white power that enslaved people required liberation from, and is therefore marked by a violent irony. The door of no return is a space that romantic abolition attempts to close, but it cannot, as it is forged upon it. As Dion Brand writes, why consider the door of no return? Because it exists without prompting. It exists despite all the efforts to obscure it or change it or reinterpret it by its carpenters or passengers. Sylvia Wynter tells us that the end of the 18th century forged, quote, a new economically determined concept of man. The economic conception of the human, man, induces us all to behave as producers, traders, or consumers. It unifies us as a species in economically rather than as before theologically absolute terms. More than this, Wynter tells us that it is our academic disciplines that reproduce the economic conception of being human. Quote, the bioeconomic conception of the human that we inscript and institute by means of our present disciplines and their epistemic order determines the hegemony of the economic system over the social and political systems. So following Wynter, what I'm really stressing here is that because a romantic abolitionism emerges out of these putative oppositions to chattel slavery without ever abolishing the economic world order inaugurated by opening the door of return, it is caught in this unresolvable irony. Cooper's very language emphasizes this. The wealth created by sinews now make freedom itself an economic good. Dear as freedom is, and is prized above all price, freedom remains a commodity here, and he imaginatively trades places with an enslaved position to refuse its cost. Abolition made emancipation a literal purchasable commodity that defines white freedom, and we've never moved past this. The 22 million pounds sterling that enslavers were given as compensation for emancipation in 1833 makes this abundantly clear. Neoliberal man is forged as economic while excluding Black people from the transaction. A moment of attending to the captive maternal then. For she is whom we must be intimate with if we are to abolish romantic humanism. Mary Prince tells us of her fellow enslaved woman, Hetty, quote, she was very kind to me and I used to call her my aunt. Hetty's voice comes to us through Mary Prince, through Susanna Strickland, through Thomas Pringle, and through the Anti-Slavery Society, but this is what she has to tell us. Have mercy upon me, don't kill me outright. As Prince tells us, Hetty words have no power to protect her. Captain I whips her when she is pregnant, probably with his own child, and she dies. The pain one might feel on reading this passage must not be abolitionist pity that imagines liberating Hetty from enslavement and torture. The Black matrix here, James tells us, must be kept closer. Romantic humanism must listen to Hetty if it is not to become a lie. Hetty is structurally presented in the history as the opposite of the ethos of Thomas Pringle's Anti-Slavery Society, but she's not. They never demolished the forces that killed her. The wresting of Black mothers from their children and punishment of them for building through kindness and mutuality continues. As I finished writing this, the announcement came out that Consuelo Dotson Africa, a member of the Move family, had passed away due to COVID, and according to her friends, grief for her two daughters. Tria and Netta, aged 13 and 15, were murdered by the state in the 1985 police bombing of the group's home in Philadelphia in spring 2021, Consuela and other mothers who lost their children that day were told that their children's remains had been taught in anthropology classes by Dr. Alan Mann at Princeton and Pennsylvania. So our disciplines are fully implicated. I'll end now with John Agard's poem, Toussaint Louverture acknowledges Wordsworth's sonnet to Toussaint Louverture. This was written in 2006, coming up to the bicentenary of British abolition. And I'm going to suggest that this could be Agard inviting Wordsworth into the Black matrix as a non-gendered space of caretaking. I have never walked on Westminster Bridge or had a close-up view of daffodils. My childhood's roots are in the Haitian hills, where runaway slaves make a freedom pledge and scarlet poncianas flaunt their scent. I have never walked on Westminster Bridge or speak like you with Cumbrian accent. My tongue bridges Europe to Dahomey. Yet how sweet is the smell of liberty when human beings share a common garment. So thanks, brother, for your sonnet's tribute. May it resound when the Thames text stays mute. and what better ground than a city's bridge for my unchained ghost to trumpet love's decree. Toussaint's voice here offers Wordsworth the progeny of Wimtheria Bridge, not Westminster, but his tongue, his voice and words that cross the European from Europe into Dahomey, should they be willing to come. And in Mbembe's words, to tease out alternative possibilities for thinking life and human futures in this age of neoliberal humanism and individualism, we need to connect in entirely new ways. This paper is to argue that a space of mutuality suggested is outside of anything, sadly, that Romanticism, Wordsworth, Cooper, or white abolition might have to offer, but we might find other ways there.
Am I next? Yeah. Hi, everyone. I want to begin by expressing my gratitude to Kate Singer and Chris Washington for putting this event together, which I think is really special. I spent a number of years ago wondering whether more than just a couple of people would want to talk to me about the sort of possibilities of a kind of frontier contact zone between Black studies and Romanticism. And so that we're all here now at this moment is enormously kind of special and confirming for that version of me from some time ago. And I really can't wait to kind of sit back down and start taking notes again. I'm also very grateful to be in conversation with Carrie and Gina, whose work I appreciate enormously. And I'm very glad to go before Gina because that's a lot of pressure. It's a lot of pressure to go after. I want to offer just actually before that, I want to do a kind of acknowledgement in the spirit of the title of the conversation, citation, appropriation, and abolition. I just want to sort of name at the outset a couple of generations of Black women and women scholars without whose work I really wouldn't be able to think about early African-American and early Black print culture. So Dorothy Porter, Frances Smith Foster, Carla Peterson, Joycelyn Moody, Gabriel Foreman, Joan Sherman, and Jean Fagan Yellen, these women in making the Black writing of the late 18th and 19th century visible through the kind of, especially the late part of the 20th century, but some of them are still doing that work. We really wouldn't be here today without their extraordinary efforts. And I'll come back to them at the end of my remarks. But I want to just say four kind of quick things. The first two are points that are kind of like touchstones or watchwords that I followed when I set out to start thinking about this now well over 10 years ago. And then the second two are sort of things I think of as kind of agenda items for the present. And so I'll just take them one by one. So point one, as I started to think through the ways that Black writers were appropriating the aesthetic and ideological legacy of Romanticism, European and American, I started to look, one of the things I did was look for thinkers on the European side who would help me kind of bridge the gap. So people in the kind of tradition of European Romanticism, post-Romanticism, who were in various ways kind of who had done something that made the kind of discourse of Romanticism seem open to Blackness and Black writing and Black authors in some way. So one of the names that came to me fairly quickly was that of Antonio Gramsci, the early 20th century Marxist thinker. In reading through Gramsci on this subject, I followed the lead of Stuart Hall, Edward Said, and Gayatri Spivak, as well as the controversial historian of US Southern slavery, Eugene Genovese. And then later on, of course, there's a kind of dissenting essay on this tradition by Frank Wilderson. But in particular, for the moment, I want to read into the record of today a remark about Romanticism from the prison notebooks, which you can find in English in an anthology entitled The Selections from the Cultural Writings. And this is Gramsci. He's talking about, Gramsci's talking about whether or not Italy actually kind of achieved a fully realized kind of version of Romanticism. And it's from the pages and the notebooks on the figure of the intellectual, and he's including in the category of the intellectual both kind of artists like Manzoni and Verdi, as well as kind of more traditional forms of intellectuals. So this is Gramsci. Among its other meanings, Romanticism has assumed that of a special relationship between intellectuals and the people, the nation. So Romanticism is a special relationship between intellectuals and the people or the nation. It struck me some years ago that the matter of a, quote, special relationship between intellectuals and the people was of some concern for Black studies, and that Black studies represented a very kind of specific and complex instance of a dynamic between the intellectuals and the people. And that to think through the kind of prospect of a Black romanticism, which was what I set out to do, would really require kind of reckoning that dynamic in some way. So that's point one for the moment. So point two, right? There have been across the 20th century, a kind of number of robust considerations within Black studies of the figure and relative authority of the Black intellectual, which likewise, then I started to think about reading backwards into the 19th century. So I'm thinking in particular for today of an essay by Ralph Ellison entitled The Little Man at Chehaw Station, The American Artist and His Audience, first published in 1977. It would be, in an earlier moment, sort of ridiculous for me to summarize the contents of this essay in a conference on Black studies, because people who did Black studies in earlier moments would have had no choice but to know the argument of the little man at Chehaw Station. But because of the particular nature of this day, I think it might help for me to just give a little bit of background. So it's basically kind of a personal essay about Ellison's formation as an artist. And it's structured around two anecdotes. The first of which is a story about his training as a musician at the Tuskegee Institute, and a moment in which he had performed badly at a recital and been, judged not up to snuff, kind of, and he goes and talks to his music teacher, Miss Harrison, who tells him this thing, which he remembers, and he's reflecting in 1977 on events that happened decades earlier. So the teacher tells him that he has to play no matter where he is or who in front of at his absolute best, even in front of the little man at Chehaw Station, which is this train station near the Tuskegee Institute, which is particularly kind of derelict in its composition, And so Ellison is aghast by this and spends years kind of puzzling over it, right? Who is the little man at Chehaw Station, and why do I need to play well for him, right? So he arrives at this conclusion. He serves as a metaphor for those individuals we sometimes meet whose refinement of sensibility is inadequately explained by family background, formal education, or social status. So here's an instance where assumptions that we might make about the special relationship between the intellectuals and the people might be kind of scrambled, right? So that maybe there are intellectuals among the people is a kind of conclusion that a kind of Black studies reading of this sense of romanticism might entail, kind of, right? It's a metaphor for those individuals we sometimes meet whose refinement of sensibility is inadequately explained by family background, formal education, or social status. So for Ellison, the little man becomes a symbol of the way cultural practice bedevils easy assumptions about race and class and intellectual life. The essay ends with a spectacular anecdote confirming this presence. This is the second half of it, right? In which the young Ellison, later working for the Federal Writers Project in New York, but still in the 30s, encounters a group of Black men covered in soot in a San Juan Hill boiler room. And they're arguing about the Metropolitan Opera. So back to opera. I can't reproduce the delicately brilliant and self-effacing humor of Ellison's realization at this moment, which is, I'll give away the joke, which is that the men all have side gigs when they're not in the boiler room performing as extras at the opera. And so they're there listening to the opera, But I think the closing line is worth remembering in regard to these questions these questions of kind of appropriation and citation. So this is Ellison. Where there's a melting pot, there's smoke. And where there's smoke, it is not simply optimistic to expect fire. it's imperative to watch for the phoenix's vernacular but transcendent rising. Now, point 3. So I've been talking sort of anachronistically about 20th century thinkers reflecting on the crisis of the 1930s. Gramsci from a fascist prison in real time, Ellison looking backwards from 40 years on, the 1970s, both improbably thinking about opera. It has long been noted that the 30s involved reckoning the legacy of the Romantic period and its expression through fascism, socialism, and liberalism. It was also a moment, like the present, of abolitionist revival, now recognizable best to us as kind of scholars through the publication, the kind of near simultaneous publication of W.E.B. Du Bois's Black Reconstruction in 1935 and C.L.R. James's Black Jacobin in 1938. So I'm thinking about like what we are up to today, doing a conference about Black studies and Romanticism here in 2021, you know, and thinking about what it is that it's possible for us to do. And for me, and this is a conclusion that I've reached, which is not one that I'm especially inclined to kind of claim as mine, but something that I think is going on among all of us. And I have things to say about it, but I think we kind of all do. And my sense is that we do a number of things in thinking about the late 18th and early 19th century, but one that I think we have, one place where I think we have a real contribution to make is in thinking through the kind of dynamics between abolition and liberalism, which it's my sense are kind of fundamentally and perennially interdependent. So abolition and liberalism have what to me is a necessary and kind of definitional dialectical relationship. You can't have one without the other. And actually these periodic attempts to repress abolitionist political energy, but also histories of abolition are doomed to failure and really kind of characterize the contradictory and critical nature of the present. Hence, I think the kind of explosion of interest in abolition at the moment, because we are in a period of kind of like pathologically excess liberalism, which thus demands dialectically a kind of abolition and answer. That's my sense of what's going on politically in the present, but I also think it's really important for us as kind of custodians of the historical legacy, both of slavery, but also of abolition, to help think through those dynamics. And I think we are actually doing that already, but I just want to put it as plainly as I can. So I'll say it one more time. I have the sense that abolition and liberalism are fundamentally and perennially interdependent, and that the extremities of neoliberalism necessitate the renewal of abolitionist thought in response to the US carceral state and a number of other aspects of the increasingly ancien regime of neoliberalism. To put it simply, is just as the legacy of slavery ramifies into the present, so too does that of abolition. And we as custodians of that history have important contributions to make to its unfolding. So just briefly, and now I'm going to start to get really referential and just give you a bunch of names. So I want to direct you to some very compelling research on the relations between C19 abolition and early left formulation. So very recently, Justin Leroy's contribution to a recent volume on racial capitalism involves a consideration of abolition, communism, and the philosophy of history. I'd also point out Andrew Zimmerman's really interesting research on the 19th century German left and their involvement in the US abolition movement. And then I'll put a pin in it for a moment and go to my last point. And this is to come back to the kind of legacy of Black feminist bibliographic scholarship and historicist scholarship, which really kept in view for us early African-American print culture. And so in reflecting on that legacy and mine and our inheritance of it, I want to say something about what we do as kind of educators. So this is at the risk of sort of softening the kind of revolutionist edge of the things that I've just said about Gramsci and Ellison and abolition and so forth. The closing point I want to make draws on a classic formulation of Black feminist both and epistemology, following among others Patricia Hill Collins. So I think and this is one of the, well, anyhow, I think we really must be able to think both revolution and reformist educational activism at once. I have been reminded of this again and again as a student of Black studies, going back to Robert Steptoe and Dexter Fisher's 1979 anthology, The Reconstruction of Instruction. I have also had that orientation renewed by my conversations with and around the Bigger Six Collective, where I have happily found that teaching is always a live and present concern. Likewise, in a short but forceful and recent essay by Gayatri Spivak entitled Abolition/Annihilation, she argues that the way to abolitionist futures is through a kind of humanistic education. She goes especially to K through 12. Finally, I want to draw attention to two important recent books in a long tradition of scholarship on the Black history of education. Anna Mae Duane's Educated for Freedom, which is about the New York African Free School, and Cabria Baumgartner's In Pursuit of Knowledge, Black Women and Educational Activism in Antebellum America, both of which demonstrate that 19th century Black abolitionists in the North were programmatically invested in educational institution building from the early 19th century. So this is in setting up the postbellum project of the Southern school systems, which so attracts the attention of Du Bois in Black Reconstruction. So I'm going to leave you with a line. I'm going to stop there. I'll leave you with a line I learned from Baumgartner, citing the early Black educational activist Sarah Mapps Douglas, an extraordinary early visual artist, poet, journalist, activist, and teacher, who wrote to Black girls who would be students of a school in Canterbury, a Black school for girls in Canterbury, Connecticut, which had been kind of prevented from carrying on its work by the white inhabitants of the Connecticut town where this woman attempted, not Sarah Mapps Douglas, a woman that Douglas is commenting on, but this is Douglas addressing the girls in print in The Liberator. Quote, "Be courageous, put your trust in the God of the oppressed, and go forward." And I'll stop there.
Thanks so much, everyone. Is my sound okay? Just checking. All right, excellent. I want to begin by thanking the organizers, Kate Singer in particular, for extending this invitation, which I was very happy to be able to accept. I'm also extremely grateful to everyone here who showed up for this session. And I'm extremely, extremely grateful to my fellow panelists, Carrie and Matt, who are simply wonderful people to think with. And my head is spinning a little bit with what they've given me to think with today. So I'm going to try to focus from there. I'm speaking today from Hamilton, Ontario, a city located on the traditional territories of the Haudenosaunee Confederacy and the Mississauga Nation, within the lands protected by the Dish with One Spoon Wampum Agreement. Versions of this treaty agreement to share the resources of the Dish peaceably, taking what one needs with care to leave what others need, and working together to keep the Dish clean, healthy, and thriving, have existed in this region since time immemorial. The wampum belt that remains in effect currently was ratified between the Haudenosaunee and Anishinaabe peoples at the Great Peace of Montreal in 1701. And I describe the Dish with One Spoon Wampum in that way as a way of laying out the particular temporality, which is both immemorial, not mappable according to Eurocentric timelines on the Gregorian calendar, but that are also part of what we call the long 18th century. A few miles to the west of my house in central Hamilton, I'm calling in from the attic, which is where I've been holed up for the past pandemic year and calling into all my meetings. You can see the arm of the treadmill that I bought over the winter. I haven't blacked out my background because this is also a way of situating myself in my current conditions. A few miles to the west of my house in central Hamilton, just on the other side of the McMaster University campus, is the community of Dundas. Now, Dundas is actually technically part of Hamilton. That's important. There was a whole amalgamation before I moved to this area that was very fraught. So it is part of Hamilton, but it refuses to call itself Hamilton. It insists on calling itself Dundas, even though Dundas technically no longer exists. I don't live in Dundas because property values have always been too high for me to afford there. In this post-industrial city where wealth is distributed in starkly disproportionate ways, Dundas is where the greatest wealth tends to pool. When my partner and I moved here in 2009 from the US, people from Toronto joked that Hamilton was an industrial wasteland and that downtown, where I live now, was a dystopian ruin. Yet Dundas's main street was so picturesque then and now that it routinely served as a movie set for picturesque all-American towns, for example, as a series of New Hampshire townships on President Bartlett's campaign trail on the West Wing in 2005. My friend and colleague, Caitlin Debicki, a Mohawk woman from nearby Six Nations of the Grand River, lives with her partner and child in Dundas. Lately, the police have been harassing her, having been called in by a neighbor, they don't know which one, complaining about where they place their trash, how long the grass is in their backyard, and vague concerns about the child who lives in that house, who was seen in the window on a day when the car was not in the driveway, for example, leading a concerned citizen to report that perhaps the child had been abandoned. All this has been going on as we in the place currently known as Canada reckon with the unearthing of mass graves of children murdered by the residential school system that stole Native children from their families and systematically killed them in culture, in spirit, and in mass numbers in body. And just today, another report of over 750 unmarked graves at the site of a residential school in Saskatchewan that closed in only 1997 is all over the Canadian newsfeed. And it's very hard to think under the conditions of these unearthings, which don't generate any new knowledge. These are not discoveries, but they are confirmations of horrible knowledge that has been carried in disproportionate ways by people who live here. And Carrie's discussion of womb theory is particularly resonant for me in this context. Dundas is named for Henry Dundas, a prominent Scottish politician of the late 18th and early 19th centuries. One of Toronto's main streets is also named for him. Last year, amidst the global Black Lives Matter protests, a petition bearing over 3,000 signatures was submitted to Toronto city leaders demanding that the street be renamed in recognition of the fact that Henry Dundas was instrumental in delaying Britain's abolition of the trade in enslaved people by 15 years. In response to the petition, Toronto's mayor assigned preliminary research into the possibility of renaming streets in general to a working group, deploying a bureaucratic stalling tactic akin to the ones Dundas himself used in British Parliament to draw out firm action against the British slave trade from 1792, when William Wilberforce sponsored the motion in the House of Commons to abolish the trade, to 1807, when the House of Lords finally voted in favor. Hamilton's Dundas remains the city's most prominent white haven from poverty. I open with this account as an example of the kinds of citational practice I have learned and have been learning to practice from Black and Indigenous knowledge communities. One of these practices, which is the one I'm attempting here, is a commitment to thinking in and from place, a practice that has recently been taken up more widely in academia in the form of what we call land acknowledgements. As we have witnessed land acknowledgements rapidly turn from disruptive to routine gestures in academic spaces, I've been considering whether it would be more useful to insist on them as a mode of citation, not merely a passing nod, but a conceptual grounding of where and how our thinking takes place in worlds that colonialism has created. Citations of our own placements, both geographically and historically, make it impossible to approach the scholarly object of Romanticism, whether as a time period, a cultural movement, or a literary style, without a critical understanding of racial capitalism and settler colonialism, and not as they were in the 18th and 19th centuries, as they are now, and as we are within and under them. I'm speaking today not as an authority, but as a student of Black studies, to argue that if there is any hope of the fields currently known as 18th century studies and Romanticism studies becoming sites of meaningful reckoning with the worlds that took shape then and continue to condition our lives now, then they urgently need to reorient themselves in relation to Black and Indigenous ways of knowing. And I'm echoing here Carrie's statement earlier that Romanticism, that Black studies does not need Romanticism, but Romanticism needs Black studies. I'm also speaking as someone with professional and intellectual responsibilities to the field of literary studies of the long 18th century. My ongoing study of Black intellectual work and knowledge ways has brought me to understand that any scholarly field that is not or cannot be transformed into a place in which Black thought, life, and joy can flourish is not a field worth preserving or dedicating ourselves to. 18th century studies is the field in which I have staked my expertise, and my long 18th century runs straight through the Romantic era in Britain. It is not a field that has historically included Black ways of knowing, much less centered them. The question of whether the field might be transformed is, in my opinion, wide open right now. For me, as a non-Black scholar who is tenured and who edits one of the main journals in the field, I aim to practice my expertise in ways that honor the field as it should be, not the field as it has been. I practice my loyalty to studies of the literature and culture of the long 18th century, in other words, by putting my energy toward the collective effort to make this field a safe, generative, and joyful space for Black scholars and Black thought. If these efforts require the field to transform into something that is no longer recognizable as 18th century studies, then so be it. If the disillusion of 18th century studies into something new and better also dissolves the platforms on which some of us have achieved professional recognition at the expense of Black scholars and scholarship, then this is an indication that we have met our responsibilities. Citational practice is important because citation is one of the main ways a field or discipline reproduces itself. If we aim to practice our scholarship in ways that transform rather than faithfully reproduce existing fields and existing worlds, then we ought to develop methods of citing differently. For several years, I've taught the politics and practices of citation to graduate students via Sarah Ahmed's Living a Feminist Life, in which she makes a point of citing feminists of color rather than white experts, noting that, quote, citation is how we acknowledge our debt to those who came before. In 2018, however, my understanding of citational practice was transformed by a talk that Catherine McKittrick gave here at McMaster, titled Footnotes, Books and Papers Scattered About the Floor, in which she discussed Black citation practices and the urgency of not merely revising the lists of names that recognize our intellectual debts, but embracing modes of citation that relinquish practices of naming, crediting, counting, and assigning altogether, notational structures that are steeped in the colonial history of anti-Black knowledge systems. How do we honor the debts and connections, McKittrick asked, that cannot be named as a direct result of anti-Black violence? How do we cite knowledge ways that are not carried in individual persons and texts? In her astonishing new book, Dear Science and Other Stories, McKittrick models some possibilities. Dear Science, she writes, takes into account how Black intellectual life is tied to corporeal and affective labor, flesh and brains and blood and bones, heart, souls, by noticing the physiological work of Black liberation. These labors are, however, impossible to track and capture with precision. In noticing the physiological work of Black liberation, I am asking for a mode of recognition that does not itemize, commodify Black liberation and Black embodied knowledge. Indeed, tracking down, quantifying, and/or endlessly describing Black corporeal and affective and physiological labor belies the kinds of Black studies these stories tell, end quote. The question I wish to draw from these words is, what kind of methodological transformations would it take to make 18th century and Romanticism studies sites where these kinds of stories could be told, where these kinds of Black studies could be practiced? Any area of scholarship that aspires to this level of care for Black studies has to grapple fundamentally with its existing modes of recognition and how they generate and assign value to scholarship, to ideas, to worlds, to people. Given that the long 18th century instituted the principles of intellectual property that continue to structure academic knowledge circulation today, I propose that specialists in this area have a particular responsibility to strategize the dismantling of citation methods grounded in the settler colonial plantation-based property economy. Could Romanticism studies become a site where imperialist measures like ownership, merit, credit, and individual achievement and impact no longer structure how we relate to one another as thinkers and how our work relates to the work of others? Are these conditions even possible within the institution we call the university? I don't yet know, but Stuart Hall continued to believe in the university, and so I do too for now, with the understanding that my commitment is to freedom and liberation of and within the academy, if possible, and from it, if necessary. Releasing scholarly citational practice from colonial economies of value requires nothing less than a full cultural overhaul of how we as living and thinking beings recognize one another and relate to one another as such. No one is going to be able to take credit for such a thing, because nothing short of a dedicated and coordinated collective effort is going to be able to do it. Knowing this releases each one of us from the cruel math of calculating how such work can be made to count professionally, urging us to ask instead, from my position in relation to others, what can I contribute to these efforts? What am I responsible for? And how will I meet and build on these responsibilities for the collective good? Because creating conditions for Black knowing and for what McKittrick calls Black livingness is a collective good, a move toward our collective liberation from life ways and knowledge ways tethered to the brutal arrangements of power under settler colonialism, racial capitalism, and white supremacy. Thank you.
I can start us, I guess. Or so thanks so much to you both for those incredibly suggestive talks, and I'm always so grateful to be in this conversation because I come to it from a very weird angle. So I don't have a job in an English department. I work in American and ethnic studies. And so I'm no longer kind of as often in the context of having to think through the same questions about value and literature that so many of my interlocutors in conversations like this one do have to think through. And also I come to Romanticism sort of more from training in Black studies than vice versa. And so that's always kind of, I find provides me a kind of weird vantage on these things. And so I guess like, for me, when I started out, I came to Romanticism kind of with, I think, what feels to me now after listening to you guys talk and also in reflecting on conversations I've had with Bigger Six folks too, and just in general lately around Romanticism, I came to Romanticism with what I have realized now on reflection was this kind of naive optimism, which is to say that I thought like, oh, Romanticism is this like kind of source of, yes, white European cultural authority, but like I think maybe there's a whole long story of Black historical figures appropriating that cultural power to their own ends. And that was really like a major point of departure for me. And so I guess I just wonder like whether you all can, what does it sound like to you? What does it sound like to you when you think in optimistic terms about the dynamic between Black studies and Romanticism? Because for me, I look at an event like this and think, oh, cool, like there's hundreds of people like thinking about Black studies and Romanticism, you know? And so maybe, again, maybe there's a kind of naivete in that perspective, but I guess I just wonder what when you two think optimistically about the state of things at the moment, what do you think?
I don't think, no, I mean, I'm probably going to annoy a lot of people. I just don't think that's a union. I mean, I think it's what I'm getting out of this conversation and with this conference. I mean, what I'm worried about is Romanticism appropriating Black studies to make itself, you know, look diverse, multicultural, in ways that don't transform the disciplinary and intellectual boundaries that it still places. So, you know, my own journey to Romanticism is antagonistic. You just read any Caribbean writer, you know, V.S. Naipaul, Selwyn Cudjoe, Sam Selvin, you know, this simultaneous, the other kind of double consciousness that you have as a colonized subject. So I went through a colonial school system. I was reading Wordsworth in primary school, feeling that, you know, yes, there are no daffodils here. So when I read John Agard's first line, it's actually not just a rhetorical gesture, it's a rejection of an experience that was thrust upon you in the colonial educational system, that tries to bring you into a way of being that you know is not yours, but that you also know how to sort of enter into to some degree. And certainly for me, like a lot of other people from the Caribbean who've ended up not being able to reside in their place of origin and having to be in exile for a long time, that brings up other certain antagonisms. And then, of course, like any good student, you know, entering a university program and wanting to show, yes, I know my Shakespeare and I know my Wordsworth, and oh yes, Shelley's a little bit more radical, but didn't like him either. So, I mean, that long journey, you know, I was told by my PhD committee not to do Caribbean literature for my thesis, and I was pretty much made to become an 18th centuryist against my will. So for revenge, I started looking at the journals of enslavers, and that didn't go down particularly well. So I mean, I suppose I have a totally antagonistic relationship, and I feel, frankly, that I feel the lies of Romanticism as lies, lies about freedom, lies about liberty, lies about equality, and I think it has to start dismantling a lot of those claims that it makes via people who, you know, people who are talking, the people I've cited in my paper don't need, John Agard doesn't need Wordsworth. Wordsworth really needs John Agard. That's, in blunt terms, what I'm proposing.
And I think that I probably round out this trio in a nice way affectively, because I don't think I have a particularly optimistic or antagonistic relationship to Romanticism, but I was trying to come up with the right adjective. I think I have like a perversely hopeful relationship to Romanticism, which is that I actually feel extremely hopeful about the possibility that Romanticism studies and 18th century studies might implode and be reborn as something completely different that we don't really know the contours of yet, you know, but we know the kind of energy that we can pull together in order to like bring that unbecoming and rebecoming about. And I call it perverse because as a, self-declared 18th centuryist, I think it is a little bit perverse to feel hopeful about the end of 18th century studies, but I do feel hopeful about it. I think that there's enormous potential for learning to read differently, but also to relate to one another differently. And the antagonism of the moments of deep disappointment, that Carrie is describing, or of anger, are very familiar to me. Like those are not fun moments. Those are not moments that feel hopeful at all. But the insight that they grant is really crucial. Like being disappointed by the structure of the field that you've learned to think in again and again, or feeling, affronted by it, or feeling the pressure, like a bad pressure, from it. Those instructive moments are awful, but they're really important. And so the hope of those kinds of things giving way is born out of that. I don't want to take too long, but I did want to mention that I've been thinking a lot about this video that I saw, an interview with Honoré Fanon Jeffers about her book, The Age of Phyllis, and her research on Phyllis Wheatley Peters. That was recorded, it's online, you can find it if you Google, for the Revolutionary Spaces series. It's called Looking for Miss Phyllis. And Jeffers talks there about how, when she was a fellow at the Massachusetts Antiquarian Society, or maybe it's the American Antiquarian Society, I don't remember, she went to the Massachusetts Historical Society's holdings where they have Phyllis Wheatley Peters letters, and was denied access to them by a librarian or an administrator who said to her, quote, "Not just anybody can look at those letters." And eventually, phone calls were made, and, she was given access, but was under supervision. And so she talked about the way that the Historical Society still claims Phyllis Wheatley Peters as property, right? As property for white America, white history, and white ways of knowing. And in talking about her own work, she said, I recognize how good a lot of the scholarship is on Miss Phyllis. I don't deny that the existing scholarship is good, but I was the only one who loved her. And I've been thinking a lot about love as a scholarly mode, and what it would mean for us to take that up as a method, and what conditions would have to be in place before we could even try without appropriating, right? So I feel hopeful about that too.
Yeah, I think the thing that's really at the heart of it is that, we're so used to talking about, Matt, your work, the double consciousness of Du Bois, but white studies, Romanticism is not used at all to talking about its own internal double consciousness. That's maybe a shift that could be productively made, to think about what Joy James names as this, hypocrisy, internalized hypocrisy. But it's not just, it's structural, it's deeply structured, and it's deeply woven into our disciplines, and it's deeply historical as well. So I'm not sure what it takes, but that might, if I'm asking for anything, it is for that to become the object of our study.
Kate, can I ask about time? Should we open up to the audience? I feel like we're running out of time, or we are out of time. I don't know how long the session goes.
We have until 3:15. So
okay.
if you have, I was gonna kind of try and pivot you around 3, but if you want to take, it's up to you all. If you want to take a few more minutes to talk.
Yeah, I'm happy to go a few more minutes. I was thinking 3 for some reason. So, okay, we're good. We're good.
I have a question for Matt, if that's okay, and well, really for both of you. But I mean, the light at the end of the tunnel, the optimism in your papers seems to be around social activism, actual movements that do stuff and that reformulate on the ground and at community level. And to completely contradict myself, I've always had a grudging admiration for somebody like Hannah More, deeply conservative woman. But, I lived in Somerset for a long time. And when I saw the valleys and the hills that she had to go around in her little cart to deliver whatever aspect of goodness she thought she was delivering, I couldn't dismiss it simply. And I've thought deeply about what does it mean to try to do good in that way, and what does that mean? But I wondered if you had to maybe say more about social reform and restructure, social movements at grassroots level that you both spoke about.
I find I don't have like a bunch to say about social movement activism at the moment. I mean, I think one of the things that's been super interesting about the past year, with respect to the kind of work that we do in our relation to movement work, has been, for me anyhow, like how often I see indications that people involved in activism and movement work are also hungry for kind of academic writing about the history of slavery, or academic writing about the sociology of policing and mass incarceration. So that I find sometimes in kind of academic spaces, even when we're doing kind of, work that is somehow radical, we often kind of diminish the value that work is perceived to have outside of the academy. So that when you see like the kind of, the Google Drive with literally hundreds of Black Studies academic books in it, because people are so kind of desperate to get access to that knowledge, and that it's being shared kind of through these basically, abolitionist activist spaces, to me that point of contact between the knowledge making that we do and the work that people who are kind of proper activists full time are doing, that to me is another kind of point of optimism. But I guess since I'm unmuted and talking, I also want to make a point that's not so much about activism, but back to kind of optimism more generally about the academy and about Black studies and Romanticism more generally. I feel like I want to draw a comparison to the dynamic between Black studies and Romanticism and other kinds of maybe possibly moribund or otherwise kind of like diminished fields in the academy, fields which have shrunk kind of over the course of the late 20th century especially. So intellectual history is also a field which has seen an enormous kind of explosion of work after kind of in the context of the growth of Black studies. Likewise, people have done enormously important work in political economy, not a field that's especially well represented in the American Academy, but which is all of a sudden kind of in the context under the attention of Black studies scholars kind of exploded in its interest. Philosophy of history, political theory, political theology, all of these kind of like subfields that have over the past 200 years kind of repressed the history of slavery and abolition, but now like all of a sudden are kind of facing up to and acknowledging that history. To me, the possibilities there are really extraordinary. And the possibilities not only kind of like, oh, we can publish articles or whatever, but the possibilities in terms of the way that we can make concepts that can be of use to people on the ground doing activist work. So that's me being more optimistic again, I guess.
Yeah, I would say that I think for me, again, as someone who's a professional academic and not a full-time activist, my approach to it has been, and recently, this is something I've kind of come to after years and years of professionalizing myself as an academic, and then having one of these moments that you're pushed to through frustration and disappointment and and revelation and whatever, and having done some reading where you suddenly realize that you've been doing things in a particular way. You've been doing things in a systemic way because you've been conditioned by the system, of the academy. And you realize that you want to stop doing things that way. And for me, it was kind of realizing that the impulse, like the scholarly impulse, it tends to be, when you look around you, asking the question like, oh, what can this do for me, right? Like if I'm thinking in place, like I'm in this place, how can that place like inform my work? How can this place be useful to the idea I'm trying to have? And it's, it's not in and of itself an evil impulse, but it's an appropriative one. I mean, that's the operation of colonial appropriation, just replicating itself in and through us over and over, even when we're trying to like be ethical thinkers. And so for me, growing my relationship to local activism, and not just local activism on different levels through my practices as a scholar, has been part of this ongoing, process of trying to learn to reorient my own scholarly impulses, so that rather than ask what can this do for me, to ask myself, well, is what I'm trying to do good for this, right? Like, is what I'm writing right now at all useful to the place that I'm in? And the place includes the activist movements that have been happening, that have been happening for a long time, that are happening, here, whether I know about them or not, whether I participate or not. So learning about place is also about learning about community and community work. And so just putting that kind of general pressure on our work as scholars to ask, not so that, if we can't write a sentence that's not directly addressed, to a particular movement, but just to, when you're putting pen to paper, right? It's very anachronistic, but so be it. When you're putting pen to paper, going to the paper with the thought of, am I about to write something down that gives something, out to where I am in the world or in history, rather than, am I about to make something good out of what I've taken in from the world?
Maybe now would be a good time to open it up to questions from everybody. If you want to signal using your reaction in hand, or if you want to write something in the chat. Wendy, you have a question.
Thank you. Hi. So I'm a Germanist, also Caribbean, from Trinidad and Tobago, and in the United States. So I remember in 2007, there was a Romanticism conference in London. It was a big conference to commemorate the abolition of the British slave trade. And I remember being very excited about this, and I thought I should go. But then I looked at the list of papers, and there was not one talk about the British slave trade. And I felt that the thing that was being commemorated was repressed. And I'm wondering how that, it's been over 10 years now. So I'm wondering if the field has evolved, at least to the point where that wouldn't happen, maybe in 2034 or something like this, with, the abolition of slavery or so in Britain. Thanks.
I'd love to say a few words, Wendy. I find 2007 being a really starting off academic in the United Kingdom. I was in Bristol at the time. I found it overwhelmingly awful. It was. I myself gave a talk from Wilberforce's. Trying to remember, Wesley's pulpit in Bristol, because that was one of the few venues that was available for me to speak at, and that talk about complicity. And what I said wasn't particularly well received. Yes, it was. I think there was a lot of talk at the time. The reviews were about Wilberfest. It turned into Wilberfest. It turned into commemoration, and Alardo Equiano was kind of ruled out. And Mary Prince was ruled out a little bit as sort of representative Black people who were liberated by good white people. I think that what you've just said really is at the heart of what I'm getting at. I can't see how. I'm now living in a state where what I'm saying is quickly about to become illegal as a professor. You know, the critical race theory bans. I am becoming an activist now because we're having to join up with school teachers and electoral reformers at grassroots level, and we're going to have to take action to overturn these terrifying laws. Alabama too, you know, there's several states. So, and the United Kingdom, I mean, it was so tremendous to see Colston's statue go down, but then the fallout after that, what way did that action move the needle? It seems to have moved the needle in the opposite direction, where Black Lives Matter has now become, you know, a word one cannot say in the United Kingdom either. So I know I'm talking more sort of outside of the academy, but maybe we want to reflect as a group on that contradiction between hires in Black studies, hires and call for critical race studies experts into departments that haven't got good track records on keeping faculty of colour by any means, and that aren't making any promises about how to transform hostile spaces for the people of colour they recruit. How does that match up with this public context? Maybe other people have something to say about this, but Carrie's laughing.
I'm just thinking about the daily reality. Sorry, go ahead, Wynn.
But that was an
I was just saying thank you.
I was just thinking in response to that my sense of the difference between now and then 2007 is, and this is really the result of both activism and research, two strands. One, a kind of much more robust acknowledgement and awareness of the role of sexual violence in the slave trade has really forced people to confront a kind of truth that they maybe had been unwilling to confront in earlier moments. And then two, the work that's gotten done around slavery and the history of capitalism and the role of credit and banks and financialization in supporting the system has really forced, institutions and corporations and so forth to kind of, again, acknowledge a certain kind of truth content to the history that in prior instantiations have been, yes, much more effectively repressed than I think it is now. Not to say that now everybody kind of, as Carrie points out, we're outlawing critical, quote unquote, critical race, so we don't live in the best of all possible worlds, but I do think that there have been important discursive shifts since that moment that I want to read into the record.
Bakari, I want to hear what you were about to say. I don't want it to get lost in the flow.
I just that Carrie pointed to me. I was apparently very giddy, and I was just thinking about the sort of daily pressures and resistances one must put up in a PWI. It's just that's it.
Mike has a comment in the chat for Gina. Mike, do you want me to read it or do you want to ask it?
Okay, sure. I mean, it's for me, again, thank you to all the presenters. This is fantastic, and for everybody in the conversation here. So for me, this question for me is maybe even less of a question, but me just trying to kind of articulate even kind of the nexus of kind of where the conversation is, that Romanticism has embedded within it certain ideas like genius loci, right? So thinking about situatedness and the importance of place, but then that precisely though is a nexus in Romanticism where with what particular romantics do with that place is incredibly telling. And what we're trying to do here is do new things with place, or rethinking what the genius, what the idea, the spirit of that place might be, and largely thinking about much more material matters, right? Less genius and more the matter of place. So I think I'm mostly just trying to both talk out loud here and kind of think through this locus in particular as a site of the kind of the conversation here, but I'd be very interested to know if anybody finds this of interest, to hear anybody else reflect on this if it's of interest.
Yeah, I find it enormously interesting. And I'm really glad that you asked the question. So what it brings to mind is that I just taught a brand new course. We just overhauled our first year curriculum in my department, and we produced 3 new, first year introductory level English courses. And so I just taught one that's called Making and Unmaking Literary Traditions. And it's brand new. And so I was allowed to, I'm grateful to teach in a place where, they're desperate. We're understaffed enough that they're like, you can do literally anything you want as long as you'll teach this course. And I had a lot of fun designing the syllabus. And one of the things that I tried to do was organize conversations, kind of across time periods, geographies, and knowledge communities, cultures and knowledge communities that seem to be like working with similar frameworks or like intellectual points of engagement, but of course also had some radically different positions in relation to those things. And one of them was like place thought, and romantic place thought was definitely part of that. We read Wordsworth, and we read both of the Wordsworths, right? William and Dorothy. But the thing that I realized when I was designing the syllabus that was important to kind of building these little clusters, like cross-cultural clusters, intellectual or aesthetic clusters, was that it was very important to lay out. I mean, we started with Antigone, right? So I started the course with Antigone. It's a first year, level course, and I needed to ease myself in. But after that, I tried to make a point of teaching Black and Indigenous writers first and introducing all of the principles, all of the figures, all of the, all of the frameworks via Black thought and Indigenous thought. And then bringing in Wordsworth and showing how Wordsworth might be read as in conversation with this. And what that allowed me to do was not, it was an attempt not to replicate a kind of marginalization, right? Where like you center the white writers or the European writers first, and then like show, non-European thought as a kind of supplement. But it also was the most effective way I've ever found in teaching a first year course of having students like come themselves to the realization that they wanted to be able to imagine a kind of equal conversation between, say, First Nations writers and, like settler writers, but that they couldn't because of historical conditions, right? Which is a way of thinking about like this question I'm trying to get at in my talk, like we have to attend to the structural conditions of how we relate to one another before we can say, okay, like no one has to name anyone in citation anymore, right? So that actually worked really nicely. And so I'm going to put in the chat a couple of pieces that I teach along the lines of, genius loci, but in a different tradition.
On that subject, just one more reference in case people are interested in that. A really kind of important book on African-American poetry by Keith Leonard called Fettered Genius is all about the kind of role of the category of genius through the history of African-American poetry. And it's so interesting how kind of like troubled the concept of place is within that tradition, because of course, like that sense of rootedness or indigeneity is sometimes kind of thinkable or something as in opposition to diaspora and the experience of diaspora, exile, and captivity. And just to kind of further point about Leonard's book, which really he makes a really challenging argument which is basically that like the most important figures in the African American, because a recent book makes a really challenging argument that the most important figures in the African American tradition are those who have most effectively worked through the tradition of English verse forms. So that he's really interested in kind of the sonnet and blank verse and just like Englishness as a thing that Black poets in the U.S. have that the most important Black poets in the U.S. have kind of processed.
Dan, you have a question. Dan Parker.
Hi, yeah. I guess, so first I just want to say that Patricia Matthew posted up what I think is a really, really fascinating comment. So I don't know if any of the panelists want to kind of respond to that, because I think it's, it kind of connected to the question that I have to ask in a vague sort of way. But anyway, like a piece of your conversation today has been sort of about the connection between, you know, academic writing and activism and having different kinds of feelings about, you know, how that connection can be made properly. And I guess I want to kind of bring in the question of like organization to like this discussion of like how to transform the field for scholars everywhere. And because, you know, this question is why I basically have left academia at this point. I've decided not to go for my PhD because I feel like I don't need to be eaten up by the academy. That will make me an ineffective organizer. You know, I was, you know, finishing my master's in Manchester, you know, across the ocean from the comrades I organized with locally while the pandemic was happening and Black Lives Matter protests were happening, and felt so estranged just kind of writing about, you know, Shelley and Marxism and trying to kind of, you know, put theories of prison abolition into that work, but just feeling kind of just really, really cynical about the whole process. So I guess my question is like, what kind of like practical things or spaces that we can make to really discuss practical ways that we can really organize around transforming both, you know, the field, the discipline, and academia itself, that go beyond kind of, you know, our, you know, conceptual kind of innovations of thinking about both Black studies and Romanticism, if that makes any sense. You know, what's the role of labor unions? What's the role of, you know, is it possible to transform something like the Keats-Shelley Association or BARS or NASA or whatever? So yeah, thank you.
I think your question does connect it to Trisha's in a certain way, which is that, you know, there's just the policing of what is good, what we can say, who can say what about what, editorial journals. You know, I know this is controversial, but we need to deeply question the double-blind peer review system. It is not neutral, as we all know. But, you know, I gave a lecture when I first got my first lecturing job in Oxford Brookes in the UK, and I thought, oh, these students will know what I'm talking about, because I'd been in Ireland and there were very few Black students there. So I thought these students will have an understanding of what I'm talking about. I gave a lecture on Walter Rodney and quickly got complaints. Well, my point is that, you know, Walter Rodney was a wonderful intellectual and a wonderful activist, and paid with his life for that. And, you know, he's not the only example of that. So the space that really raised up to me in a very clear way that my students did not consider that an appropriate topic for an introduction to literary, to whatever the course was, I can't even remember. And that was a real wake-up call to me in terms of what I thought I might be doing in the academy. And one continues for various reasons, or comes out and goes back in again. But I think things are getting more acute now. I think yeah, you know, these sound like empty calls. 70% of our teaching is non-tenured faculty who are severely underpaid. This is totally unsustainable. It goes against, you know, how can we write a book on Shelley and have a course load that we know is dependent on our peers, younger peers, being put into situations of economic precarity. What does that mean? What responses can be made to that? These are all deeply, and I mean, I think this is what I'm trying to just put my finger on, is that this version of romantic freedom is deeply, deeply tied, in my own view, to an articulation of the academy that we're living in right now, which is also very neoliberal and espouses certain values, while structurally, absolutely institutionalizing the opposite. So I think just, you know, the first step is to acknowledge that reality, and you know, I don't think that the academy is, you know, Wordsworth, you know, how many romantic writers didn't even finish their university career? Now, they didn't go on to be Walter Rodneys by any stretch of the imagination, but I do think that we need to value spaces outside of the academy as much more rich spaces for transformative work that Romanticism itself lays claim to. And I just think I want that claim really questioned at a deep level. And this feels like I'm not really saying very much substantial, but it's just a few initial thoughts.
I know we're out of time, so I just want to add very quickly to what Carrie said, that I also think that academics who decide to stay in academic institutions should unionize across the board, and that my introduction to labor politics and labor movements was when I was part of the union drive movement as a graduate student at Brown University in the early aughts. And that's perhaps where I learned the most, you know, in graduate school, was participating in that movement and learning to understand from participation the labor politics of the university itself. And so I think that, you know, the answer to your question specifically about like labor unions, I think that unionizing within universities is one way to break down the conceptual, you know, like the imperialist conceptual boundaries, you know, that distinguish between life and work within the academy and life and work without.
Well, let's give a huge round of applause for our amazing plenarists. Thank you for a really rich and varied conversation. We have a little 15-minute break, and maybe we'll see some of you at our 3:30 sessions. And there is a roundtable this afternoon with emerging scholars after that. So thank you, everybody, for being here, and hope to see you soon.